October 26, 2023. Santa Barbara County Courthouse, California. It wasn't the sound of a gavel being struck. We've all heard that in movies, a sharp, authoritative bang that brings a room to order. This was the sound of a gavel snapping. A sharp, painful crack of wood giving way under pure pressure. The handle, clenched in the fist of Judge Aaron Blackwood, split clean in two. The smaller piece clattered onto the bench, a tiny final sound in the dead silence that followed. Let me set the scene for you. The air in that courtroom was already thick enough to choke on. It was the third day of the victim impact statements in the trial of Lucas Thorne, a 17-year-old kid from one of the wealthiest families in the state, accused of a crime so brutal it had shattered our quiet coastal community. He was a prodigy, a genius, or so everyone said. And his defense, led by his own powerhouse attorney father, was a masterpiece. It was weaving a story of reasonable doubt so convincing you could feel the case, the justice, slipping away. For the last 20 minutes, Elena Flores had been speaking. Maya Flores's mother. She described her daughter's laugh, the one that sounded like wind chimes. She talked about the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence in her bedroom that was no longer just quiet, but a heavy, living thing. Her voice wasn't hysterical. It was worse. It was hollowed out, scraped raw from the inside. Every person in the gallery, every juror, was holding their breath, trapped in her grief. Everyone except Lucas Thorne. He sat at the defense table, perfectly postured. And as Mrs. Flores described finding her daughter's favorite book, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, her voice finally broke into a soft sob. Lucas Thorne leaned over to his lawyer, his father. He whispered something. And then it happened. The corner of his mouth twitched. Just for a fraction of a second. A tiny, upward curl. A smirk. It wasn't a smile. It was a dismissal. A silent commentary on the performance he was witnessing. In that moment, surrounded by all this human wreckage, he found something amusing. Judge Blackwood saw it. His eyes, which had been fixed on a point on his desk, flicked up. They locked onto Lucas's face. And we all watched as something in the judge's own face shut down. All the professional neutrality, the weary patience, drained away. It was replaced by something cold and terrifying. He looked at this young man, this boy who had just mocked a mother's agony in his own courtroom, and he stood up. He didn't shout. When he spoke, his voice was low, a controlled tremor that somehow filled every corner of the silent room. "You think this is a game?" That's what he said. 4 words. And with the pressure still building in his grip, the gavel in his hand, snapped. I want to ask you to do 2 quick things. First, if you're finding this story as compelling as I am, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Second, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. What you just heard was the ending. The moment the entire careful facade of this case shattered. This is the story of how we got there. This is the story of Lucas Thorne, a brilliant young man who believed he was too smart to get caught, who treated the greatest tragedy of his community like a complex logic puzzle he'd already solved. And this is the story of the one man, the judge, who decided that some crimes aren't just about evidence and procedure. Some crimes are about character. And sometimes, character gets judged in the most final way possible. We're going to rewind. Back to the beginning. Back to the glittering, privileged world Lucas Thorne called his kingdom, and to the gentle, kind-hearted girl he decided was nothing more than a variable in his equation. This is how a monster is built, thought by arrogant thought. And this is how he falls. To understand the smirk, you have to understand the kingdom. Our story doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts about 6 months earlier, in a house that looked less like a home and more like a museum exhibit titled Modern Success. Glass walls, sharp angles, floors so polished you could see your own nervous reflection in them. This was the Thorne residence, perched on the cliffs of Crestwood Bluffs like a spaceship that had landed and decided to stay. And here, in his command center, a bedroom that looked like a tech startup server room, sat Lucas Thorne, the prince of all he surveyed. If you met him then, you'd be impressed. Everyone was. 17, with a calm, analytical gaze that made adults feel like they were being interviewed. He wasn't loud, he wasn't a troublemaker. On paper, he was perfect, top of his class, aced his SATs without breaking a sweat, a champion debater. But that's just the paper. Let me show you what I mean. One Tuesday evening, while most kids were scrolling through social media or gaming, Lucas was bored. So, for fun, he logged into a shielded server and found a complex, encrypted puzzle, a kind of digital lockbox left by some online group as a challenge. Most elite college grads would sweat over this thing for weeks. Lucas solved it in 47 minutes. He didn't smile when the final firewall dissolved. He just let out a soft, almost disappointed sigh. Then, with a single keystroke, he deleted the entire solved puzzle. Not to cover his tracks, but because the challenge was over. The trophy was meaningless. The thrill was in the solving, and once solved, it was just digital clutter. That was Lucas's world. A series of systems to be mastered, puzzles to be dismantled. People were just another kind of system. His parents. They were high-functioning units. His father, the legendary defense attorney, was a program for strategic argument. His mother, the neurosurgeon, was a masterclass in precise, detached control. Affection wasn't exchanged. Performance was reviewed. So where does a mind like that go for curiosity? For a new, unsolved puzzle? It went downtown, to the old Crestwood Public Library. And that's where he saw Maya Flores. Maya was a senior at the same high school, but she lived in a different universe. She worked part-time at the library to help her family. Where Lucas saw systems, Maya saw stories. She'd remember the regulars, old Mr. Henderson who wanted westerns, the little girl obsessed with books about sharks. She'd put aside new mysteries for the bus driver who came in every Friday. Lucas watched her from the science section. He didn't feel a crush, not in the messy, human way. He observed her. The efficiency of her reshelving. The patient way she helped flustered people. Her easy, warm laugh with the children's librarian. To him, she was an anomaly. A system that ran not on logic, but on something else entirely. Something he couldn't quite label. It fascinated him. It irked him, the way an unsolved equation would. One afternoon, he walked up to her desk, holding a book on advanced fractal geometry. Not to check it out. To use it as a prop. "I'm trying to understand the local cataloging system," he said, his voice perfectly pleasant, a mirror of his father's courtroom tone. "The Dewey Decimal seems efficient, but wouldn't a hybrid system with a relational database backend be more dynamic for cross-referencing?" He wasn't asking a question. He was laying down a benchmark. Testing her system. Maya blinked, looked from him to the book, and gave a small, genuine smile. "Well, Mr. Dewey did his best in 1876. We're just grateful he didn't use cave paintings." She tapped her keyboard. "But if you're looking for books on database theory, we have a few over in section 005. She'd answered his nonsense with kindness and a little joke. And she directed him right back where he came from. Lucas didn't get the answer he expected. He stood there for a second, analyzing. The smile wasn't flirtatious. It was authentic. The response wasn't submissive or impressed. It was independent. He thanked her, walked away, and placed the geometry book back on its shelf. His mind wasn't on fractals anymore. It was wholly laser-focused on the anomaly. Maya Flores hadn't reacted according to his script. She had, without even knowing it, issued a challenge. And for a prince who had run out of puzzles in his own sterile kingdom, a new challenge was the most interesting thing in the world. He just didn't call it interest. He called it a project. And that was the first fatal mistake. The human heart, when it gets rejected, usually does a few messy things. It aches. It gets angry, or sad, or embarrassed. It might write bad poetry or eat too much ice cream. It's an emotional event. For Lucas Thorne, Maya's rejection wasn't emotional. It was a system error. A week after their first odd conversation at the library desk, he had approached her again. This time, he had devised what he called a direct query. He asked her, in the same tone he might use to request a specific dataset, if she would accompany him to an upcoming academic decathlon, an event he was certain to dominate. It wasn't a date, he explained. It would be an optimal opportunity for intellectual observation. Maya had been shelving books in the history aisle. She stopped, a heavy volume on the Battle of Gettysburg in her hands, and looked at him. Not with irritation, but with a gentle, unshakable clarity. "Lucas, that's really kind of you to think of me," she said, and she meant it. "But I'm actually busy that weekend. I think maybe we just look for different things. You're really smart. But I get the feeling you're looking for someone to analyze." She offered a small, apologetic smile. "I'm not really looking to be a project." Then she turned, slid the book onto its shelf with a soft thump, and walked back toward the front desk. That was it. No drama. No scene. Just a clear, kind, firm no. Most people would have gotten the message. Lucas just got the data. He stood in the silent aisle, surrounded by stories of ancient wars and fallen empires. In his mind, a cold, clear log was being generated. Direct query initiated. Subject response. Negative. Stated reasoning. Incompatible search parameters. Emotional valence of subject. Calm. Final. This was illogical. He had presented a fact-based proposal. He was the optimal choice. Her refusal introduced an irrational variable. His brain, a machine built for solving, began scanning for the bug in the code. Was his presentation flawed? Did he need better data on her parameters? He didn't go home hurt. He went home and got to work. In his room, the glow of multiple monitors washed over his face. He didn't hack into anything illegal. Not yet. He was too smart for that. He began with the public domain. Social media profiles set to public, the school's online directory, local news articles about the library's volunteer program. He learned about her family. Her mother worked at a medical clinic. Her younger brother, Miguel, was a soccer fanatic. He saw photos of them at a community picnic, laughing. He studied her class schedule, deduced her work hours from her check-in posts about closing shift at the library. He wasn't stalking. He was compiling a profile. To him, this was basic research. If you don't understand why a program is crashing, you gather more information about its operating environment. The more he learned, the more the anomaly grew. Her life was a web of connections, to family, to friends, to her job, to the little old ladies who loved her at the library. It was inefficient. It was emotionally costly. And yet, the system seemed to work for her. She was happy in a way Lucas could observe but not comprehend, like watching a machine run on a fuel source he couldn't identify. And that's when the objective shifted. It was no longer about gaining her approval. The puzzle had deepened. It was now about understanding the source of the error itself. Her happiness, her connections, her gentle refusal, they were all part of the same faulty, illogical code. A thought formed, clean and chilling as an algorithm's output. If you cannot fix a bug within a complex program, sometimes the most efficient solution is to isolate it, to remove it from the system entirely for further study, to run diagnostics in a controlled environment. He leaned back in his chair, the hum of the computer fans the only sound. On one screen was a map of the town, with routes between the library, her home, and the quiet, foggy stretch of coastal road in between. On another screen was her smiling profile picture. The emotional concept of revenge never entered his mind. This was purely intellectual. She was a beautiful, fascinating, unsolvable problem. And he had decided to take her offline. Thursday night. Closing shift. For Maya Flores, it was routine. The quiet, peaceful kind of work she liked. The old library had a particular smell after hours. Dust, paper, and the lemony scent of the wood polish old Mr. Jenkins used. She moved through the familiar aisles, her sneakers whispering on the linoleum. Reshelve the last of the returns. Push in the chairs. Turn off the banks of fluorescent lights, watching the shadows stretch and settle over the reading nooks. At 8:58 p.m., she tapped the keyboard at the front desk, logging out for the night. She shouldered her bag, the one with the little embroidered sunflower her brother had given her. She waved to Mr. Jenkins, the night security guard, who was already engrossed in his crossword puzzle in the lobby. "Night, Maya. Drive safe," he called, not looking up. "Radio says the fog's rolling in thick." "Will do. Good night." She pushed through the heavy front doors, and the cool, damp air hit her face. He was right. The fog was here. It wasn't a gentle mist. It was a rolling, silent blanket, swallowing the streetlights whole, turning the world into a blur of hazy gold orbs and muffled sound. You could only see maybe 20 feet in any direction. Beyond that, nothing. But it was just a 5-minute drive home. She knew the way blindfolded. She fished her keys from her bag, the jingle sounding strangely loud in the damp quiet. Her car, a little silver sedan older than she was parked in the staff lot around the side of the building. The only one left. This is the moment we want to freeze. To hold onto. Maya Flores, alive, thinking about the history essay she needed to finish, about whether her mom had remembered to pick up more milk, about the funny thing Miguel had said at breakfast. A normal girl, at the end of a normal day. She never saw him. He wasn't a monster lurking in the shadows. He was a logic problem, solved. Lucas Thorne was already in position, had been for 17 minutes. He was parked 2 blocks over, in a spot with no security cameras, a fact he'd verified over 3 previous evenings of observation. He wore dark, nondescript clothes, bought with cash from a store 30 miles away. Gloves. A knit cap. His phone was at home, logged into a gaming server, his avatar moving on a pre-recorded loop. He was a ghost. When Maya's taillights vanished into the fog, swallowed by the main road, he didn't follow her. He already knew where she was going. He knew a better route. A quieter one. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder as she turned onto the coastal road, the one that curved along the bluffs. A text. From an unknown number. It read, "Maya, it's Mr. Jenkins. You left your wallet at the desk. I have it. Can you come back?" A flicker of annoyance. She must have dropped it when she got her keys. She signaled, pulled over onto the wide, fog-shrouded shoulder. She put the car in park. She'd just run back. It would take 2 minutes. She grabbed her phone to text back, "Okay, Amul." The dome light of the car didn't even have time to fully brighten the fog around her. Her driver's side door was wrenched open. There was no dramatic struggle, no scream that could pierce the thick, sound-deadening fog. It was swift, clinical, efficient. A hand clamped over her mouth. A sharp, chemical smell filled her nose. The world didn't go black so much as it simply dissolved into the gray around her. In less than 12 seconds, she was out of her car, across the shoulder, and into the passenger seat of a different vehicle, a common, forgettable sedan that Lucas had acquired through a labyrinthine online rental under a fake ID he'd crafted for a previous project. Her own car was left running, the door open, the dome light a lonely beacon in the vast gray. He drove. Not fast. The fog was his perfect accomplice, a wall that hid everything. He followed his pre-planned route, back roads, no cameras. He had practiced this drive 4 times, timing stop signs, learning the rhythm of the few traffic lights. Meanwhile, back on the coastal road, a truck driver, fighting the fog, saw the abandoned car with its open door and weak dome light. He pulled over, called 911. A girl, missing. A car, just sitting there. The fog eating every detail. By the time the first police cruiser arrived, its lights painting the fog in swirling red and blue, Lucas Thorne was miles away, in a rented storage unit on the industrial side of town. He transferred Maya's limp form to a large, wheeled equipment case he had stored there weeks prior. He closed the lid. He drove the rental car to a pre-scouted lot near the bus station, wiped it down with ammonia-based cleaner, and walked the 11 blocks back to his own neighborhood, a phantom returning from the gloom. He slipped into his house through the side door at 10:07 p.m. He could hear the distant sound of the television from his father's study. He went upstairs, sat at his desk, and closed the digital loop on his gaming server Alibi. His avatar logged out. On his main monitor, a news alert popped up. Police investigate abandoned vehicle. Possible missing person on coastal route. He read the headline. Then, he minimized the window and opened his advanced calculus homework. The puzzle had been moved to a controlled environment. The next phase of study could begin. But out in the fog, a family's world had just vaporized. And all that was left was a cold, empty car, and a single embroidered sunflower, fallen on the damp asphalt. The first 48 hours were a storm of pure, unfiltered panic. For everyone but him. Police lights bathed the florist's house in a relentless, rotating cycle of blue and red. Search parties fanned out across the bluffs, their calls for Maya swallowed by the same fog that had taken her. Volunteers plastered flyers, her smiling senior portrait, on every store window and phone pole. The story led the local news, then the regional feeds. Bright student vanishes. The community of Crestwood, which had always felt safe in its wealth and isolation, was suddenly holding its breath, looking at its neighbors, wondering. The investigation was a furious machine, but it was running on fumes. The fog had erased any potential witnesses. There were no clear footprints, no stray personal items dropped in a struggle. Maya's car yielded nothing but her own fingerprints. The text message that lured her to stop? Sent from a burner phone that had been activated that afternoon and whose signal died in a drainage culvert a mile away. A digital ghost. Within 3 days, the machine needed a new input. A direction. And it found one. On the edge of town, near the old marina, a homeless man named Carl was known to sleep in a weathered lean-to. He was a gentle soul, mostly, troubled by voices no one else could hear. But when police, desperate for any lead, canvassed the area, one of Carl's neighbors, a man who didn't like the riffraff, mentioned he'd seen Carl acting twitchy near the coastal road around the time Maya disappeared. That was all it took. They brought Carl in for questioning. In his possession was a hair tie. It wasn't Maya's. But it was a woman's hair tie. In his agitated state, Carl couldn't give a clear account of his night. The narrative, thin as it was, began to crystallize, a tragic encounter with a mentally unstable individual. The public, craving both an answer and a villain, let out a collective, grim sigh. The storm of panic began to narrow into a single focused beam of outrage, pointed at the wrong man. And through it all, Lucas Thorne was the picture of concerned citizenship. 2 days after the disappearance, 2 detectives came to the Thorne residence. They were polite, thorough, and exhausted. Lucas received them in the living room, his parents a silent, imposing presence in the background. He was calm, helpful. Yes, he knew Maya from school. From the library. She seemed very nice. A quiet girl. No, they weren't friends. Different social circles. His whereabouts on Thursday night? He was home. Studying, then online gaming. He provided his username, the server details. I can pull up the session logs if that would help, he offered, his expression one of polite, eager-to-assist concern. They took his statement. They checked his alibi. And it was perfect. The digital log showed his avatar active, engaging in complex team-based maneuvers from 8:45 p.m. until well after midnight. It required constant, real-time input. It was, for all intents and purposes, rock solid. The detectives thanked him and left. He was a footnote in their report, a dead end. But Lucas wasn't done performing. The following Sunday, a community vigil was organized in the town square. Hundreds gathered, holding flickering candles that danced in the damp evening air. The grief was a physical thing, a heaviness that made everyone speak in whispers. Elena Flores stood at the front, supported by family, her face a mask of such profound loss it hurt to look at. And there, on the periphery, stood Lucas. He wore a dark jacket. His face was arranged into an expression of somber reflection. He accepted a candle from a volunteer, lit it, and held it steadily before him. He didn't fake tears. That would be an overperformance, a flaw in the code. Instead, he looked deeply thoughtful, as if contemplating the great, sad mystery of it all. From across the crowd, his eyes met those of the detectives who had interviewed him. He gave them a small, grave nod of recognition, a shared moment of solemnity. Then his gaze shifted to Elena Flores, crumpling under the weight of a hymn. He watched her, his head tilted slightly. Studying. Inside, his mind was a clean, quiet room. The vigil was data. The grief was an observable, but irrational, output. He noted the inefficiency of it all, the wasted energy on a variable that had been successfully removed from the equation. He felt the thrill of it, standing here, in the heart of the chaos he had authored, holding a symbol of the very hope he had extinguished, and being completely, utterly invisible. As the final prayer was spoken, he leaned forward and placed his candle carefully at the foot of a growing memorial of flowers and stuffed animals. He stood back up, hands in his pockets, and melted away into the night, leaving his little flame to burn alongside all the others. The police had their suspect. The town had its tragedy. Lucas Thorne had his perfect, unsolvable crime. And the real monster was no longer just a boy in a bedroom. He was a performer who had just received a standing ovation. He was hooked. Before we step into the courtroom where this all unravels, if you're hooked on this descent into arrogance, make sure you're subscribed. The real game is just about to begin. Let's leave the candlelight vigil behind. Let's step into a different kind of quiet. Every weekday morning at 5:45 a.m., Judge Aaron Blackwood's alarm clock would sound. Not a buzzer, not a radio. A simple, melodic chime. He'd rise in the dark, perform the same ablutions, select one of his 3 nearly identical charcoal gray suits. He'd drink 1 cup of black coffee from the same heavy mug. His world was a study in control, in quiet, deliberate order. It had to be. Because his job was to sit in the center of other people's chaos and make sense of it. The Santa Barbara County Courthouse was his theater, and his courtroom was the stage. By 7:30 a.m., he was at his bench, long before anyone else arrived. He'd run a hand over the smooth, worn oak of the desktop. He'd arrange his pens. He'd look out at the empty gallery, the rows of wooden benches that would soon hold the aching, angry, hopeful wreckage of human conflict. People saw a judge as a kind of machine, input facts, output verdict. But Aaron Blackwood was a former prosecutor. He knew the truth. The law was a scaffold built over a bottomless pit of human pain. His job was to walk that scaffold, careful not to look down too often, or he'd get dizzy. He carried ghosts. The ones he'd helped put away, sure. But heavier were the ones who'd slipped through the cracks. The cases where the evidence wasn't enough, where a clever defense picked apart the truth until it looked like a lie. The faces of families who left his courtroom with the hollow eyes of people who'd been told, by the entire machinery of the state, that their pain didn't add up to justice. The heaviest ghost was personal. Her name was Chloe, a younger sister, full of a laugh that could dismantle his teenage angst in 2 seconds. She'd been killed by a drunk driver when Aaron was in law school. The driver was a first-time offender from a good family. A promising future. There were mitigating circumstances. He got 4 years. Served 2. Aaron had watched his parents' faith in order, in fairness, die in that courtroom. He'd felt the scaffold shake beneath his own feet. He became a prosecutor not for glory, but to be a counterweight. To be the one who made the evidence add up. And when he finally put on the robe, he did it to be the one who ensured the scaffold held, no matter how violent the storm below. On a rainy Tuesday morning, his clerk, a perpetually tired woman named Marcia, slid a new case file onto his desk. It was thicker than most. "High-profile one, Judge," she said, her voice low. "The Thorne case. Teenager from Crestwood Bluffs. They're proceeding as an adult. Charged with the murder of Maya Flores." The name meant something. The case had been a low, mournful drumbeat in the community for months. He'd seen the headlines. He remembered the photo of the girl, the one they used on the news. He nodded, dismissed Marcia, and waited for the room to empty. Then, he opened the file. He skipped the legal jargon at the front and went straight to the photographs. Not the crime scene photos, those would come later. He went to the victim photos. School portrait. A picture of her laughing at the library, caught in a candid moment. A family photo at the beach, arms around each other, squinting in the sun. He stopped there. His finger rested gently on the edge of the beach photo. On the face of Maya's mother, Elena. The expression there. It wasn't just happiness. It was a fierce, protective joy. It was a look he remembered on his own mother's face, a lifetime ago, when she'd look at Chloe. A cold, familiar weight settled in his chest. The ghost stirred. He read the summary. The case was, as Marcia hinted, a prosecutor's nightmare. Circumstantial. No body. No murder weapon. A digital alibi that seemed airtight. The defense's motion to dismiss was already drafted, and it was brutally, logically persuasive. The state's case hinged on motive and opportunity, on painting a picture of a cold, arrogant boy. It was a story, not a chain of evidence. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his leather chair, the rain streaking the window behind him like tears on glass. He looked from the smiling beach photo to the dry, clinical text of the alibi report. He saw the defense attorney's name, Richard Thorne. The father. A legal shark known for winning impossible cases. He closed the file. The scaffold was trembling already. He could feel it. This wasn't just another case. This was a ghost from the future. A smart, remorseless kid from a powerful family, facing off against a gutted, devastated one. A case built on a feeling, on the wrongness of a smirk that hadn't even happened in court yet. He knew what his job was. To be impartial. To follow the law where it led, even into an abyss. But as he sat in the early morning gloom, Aaron Blackwood made a silent promise. Not as a judge, but as the boy who'd watched his sister's killer walk away with a slap on the wrist. As the man who still carried that failure like a stone in his heart. If this boy, Lucas Thorne, was guilty, he would not let him become another ghost. He would make the scaffold hold. No matter what. You could feel it before you even passed through the metal detectors. A different kind of electricity. This wasn't the hushed, chaotic grief of a vigil. This was a silent, pressurized buzz. The air in the courthouse hallway tasted like stale coffee, cheap perfume, and anticipation. The gallery was packed. Reporters with sharp elbows and sharper pencils. Crestwood locals whose curiosity had overcome their discomfort. And in the front row, a solid silent block of Maya's family and friends, dressed in dark colors, holding onto each other's hands like it was the only thing keeping them anchored to the earth. Then, the players took the board. The prosecution team, led by a seasoned, grim-faced woman named Ada Collins, looked like they were carrying the weight of the entire town on their shoulders. Their table was a fortress of binders and quiet resolve. The defense table was a study in calm power. Richard Thorne, Lucas's father, was every inch the legend. Impeccable suit, silver hair, a demeanor of relaxed, intellectual authority. He didn't look like a lawyer fighting for his son's life. He looked like a professor about to give a lecture on why the case against him was fundamentally unsound. And then there was Lucas. He entered, not with a shuffle or a hangdog look, but with a calm, purposeful walk. He wore a simple, respectful sweater and slacks. His hair was neatly combed. He sat, placed his hands folded on the table, and looked toward the judge's bench with an expression of attentive, sober readiness. He was the portrait of a wrongfully accused young man, composed, polite, a little confused by this terrible mistake. The jury ate it up. You could see it in their faces. They looked at him, then at the photo of Maya on the prosecution's display board, and you could almost hear the doubt creaking to life. This kid? This polite, clean-cut boy? He could do that? What they couldn't see was the commentary running in Lucas's head. As the bailiff called, "All rise," and Judge Blackwood entered, Lucas's internal monologue began. It wasn't nervous. It was analytical. Father's opening move, eye contact with Juror 4, the teacher. Establish trust. Good. When Ada Collins stood to give her opening statement, painting a picture of a cold, calculating intellect who saw a human being as a problem to be erased, Lucas listened, his face a mask of pained bewilderment. Inside, he was critiquing. Prosecution's narrative is emotionally compelling but forensically weak. She's appealing to pathos, not logic. A sign of a weak hand. He took notes on a legal pad. But he wasn't writing what anyone thought. He wasn't jotting down legal points. He was writing things like, Jury 7, banker, frowning during predatory description. Skeptical. Judge's gaze lingering on family during mention of empty chair. Emotional leverage noted. To him, this wasn't a trial. It was the most complex, high-stakes simulation he'd ever run. He was debugging the prosecution's case in real time. Every tear from the gallery, every objection from his father, every subtle shift in the judge's posture, it was all data. Input for his algorithm. The first day was a masterclass from his father. Richard Thorne dismantled the timeline. He picked apart the reliability of the fog-shrouded witness who thought they'd seen a dark car. He presented meteorologist data showing the fog was even thicker than reported, making identification impossible. He was polite, methodical, and devastating. With each point, the scaffold of the prosecution's case didn't just shake, it sounded like it was splintering. And through it all, Lucas played his part perfectly. When a particularly harsh accusation was made, he would look down, as if wounded. When his father scored a point, he would allow a tiny, fragile expression of hope to flicker across his face, quickly suppressed. He was the perfect, tragic pawn. But he wasn't a pawn. He was the player. And he was starting to believe his own press. The thrill was intoxicating. To sit here, in the belly of the beast, with the secret knowledge of what he'd done, and watch the entire lumbering system of justice try and fail to lay a finger on him, it was the ultimate validation. He had outthought them all. At the lunch recess, as he was let out, he passed the Flores family. He didn't look at them. But in his peripheral vision, he saw Maya's mother, Elena, staring at him. Her gaze wasn't furious. It was deep, searching, and unbearably sad. For a nanosecond, it pierced the algorithm. A flicker of something irrational. An unreadable variable. He pushed it aside. Irrelevant data. Sentiment. As the door to the holding room closed behind him, leaving him in a quiet, windowless space, he replayed the morning session. The jury's skeptical looks. The prosecutor's frustration. His father's cool dominance. A small, private smile touched his lips. Not a smirk. Not yet. Something more profound. He was winning. And the game was even more satisfying than he'd imagined. There are sounds a courtroom is built to hold. The dry rustle of paper. The clear ping of a lawyer's objection. The measured tone of a judge. It is not built to hold the sound of a breaking heart. The morning of the third day, the prosecution called Elena Flores to the stand. The air changed. The casual spectators leaned forward. The reporters stopped doodling. The jury seemed to collectively hold its breath. This wasn't about evidence anymore. This was the core of it. The human cost. Elena didn't look at the lawyers. She didn't look at the jury. As she walked to the stand, her eyes were fixed on a spot on the floor, as if navigating a path through a minefield. She was sworn in, her voice a whisper. She sat, her hands clenched together in her lap, knuckles white. Ada Collins began gently. "Mrs. Flores, can you tell us about your daughter, Maya?" What followed wasn't testimony. It was an autopsy of a life that was still loved. Elena spoke, and her voice wasn't loud, but in the silent room, it was the only thing. She described Maya's laugh, not just that she had one, but the texture of it. "It started in her eyes first," Elena said, a faint, ghost of a smile touching her own lips. A little crinkle. Then it would just bubble out. It was the kind of laugh that made you laugh, even if you didn't know the joke. She talked about the little things. The way Maya would hum off-key when she did the dishes. How she'd always steal the last olive from the jar. How she'd read to her younger brother Miguel, doing all the different character voices, even when she was dead tired. With each detail, the phantom of Maya Flores grew more solid in the room. You could almost see her in the empty space beside her mother. Then Elena's voice grew quieter, tighter. She described the night of October 26th. The call from the police. The drive to the coastal road in the fog, seeing the empty car, the door hanging open. Her bag was on the passenger seat, Elena said, her voice beginning to fray at the edges. The one with the sunflower. Her brother gave it to her. It was just sitting there. A juror, a woman in her 50s, dabbed her eye with a tissue. Judge Blackwood sat perfectly still, his hands steepled before his face, his gaze fixed on Elena. He didn't look at the defense table. He didn't look at the clock. Ada Collins asked the necessary, brutal question. Mrs. Flores, what has your life been like since that night? Elena Flores looked up. For the first time, her eyes swept across the room, past the jury, past the judge, and landed for a fleeting second on Lucas Thorne. He was looking down at his notepad, as if respectfully giving her privacy. It is a silence, she said, the word seeming to cost her. Not a quiet silence. A loud one. It screams from her bedroom. It bangs around in the kitchen where she isn't making a snack. It's in the passenger seat of my car. Her breath hitched, a small, broken sound. I go to the grocery store and I see the granola she liked, and my hand reaches for it. And then the silence hits me all over again. It's like living in a house where all the oxygen is gone. You just keep trying to breathe, and you can't. A sob escaped from the front row. Miguel, her son, had buried his face in his aunt's shoulder. Elena was trembling now, but she kept her eyes open wide, as if forcing herself to see it all. You don't lose a person once. You lose them 1,000 times. When you set the table for 4 instead of 5. When her birthday comes. When you hear a song. She finally looked directly at the jury, her eyes pools of utter desolation. How do you measure that loss? What is the sentence for that? The question hung in the air, unbearable and unanswerable. In the resonant, aching silence that followed, the court reporter had stopped typing. The guards had stopped shifting their feet. And at the defense table, Lucas Thorne finished making a note on his pad. He had written a single, stark line. Primary witness utilizing emotional appeal. No substantive data timeline or forensics. Inefficient. He looked up from his pad. He looked at Elena Flores, this woman vibrating with a pain that had sanctified the entire room. He saw her as a system, a biological entity producing illogical, counterproductive outputs. Grief was a waste of resources. Her testimony was a flawed algorithm, trying to solve for a variable that no longer existed. A thought, clean and cold, formed in his mind. She is describing the symptoms of a deletion. But she is blaming the delete command, not the corruption that necessitated it. He felt a faint, intellectual impatience. This was taking so long. It was so messy. Unconsciously, almost imperceptibly, his lips tightened. Not a smile. A slight, dismissive compression. A physical echo of the thought. How inefficient. He didn't see Judge Blackwood's steepled hands slowly lower to the bench. He didn't see the judge's eyes, which had been fixed on Elena, now slowly, irrevocably, turned to lock onto him. All Lucas heard was the silence. And in his mind, he was already debugging it. It was the silence that did it. That heavy, holy, awful silence after Elena Flores's last word. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full one. Stuffed with the phantom of a girl's laugh, with the image of an empty chair, with the sound of a mother trying to breathe in a world without oxygen. For a long moment, no one moved. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her machine. The jurors seemed frozen in their seats, some with tears tracking silently down their cheeks. Even the air conditioning seemed to have shut off in respect. In that kind of silence, even the smallest sound becomes an explosion. The smallest movement becomes a scream. Ada Collins, her own eyes glistening, said softly, "Thank you, Mrs. Flores. No further questions." Richard Thorne, Lucas's father, stood. This was his moment. A cross-examination here was a tactical minefield. One wrong word, one hint of aggression toward this shattered woman, and the jury would turn on him forever. He approached the stand with the caution of a man walking on glass. "Mrs. Flores," he began, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, almost kind. "I can only imagine the pain you are in. The entire community shares in your loss." He was validating her grief, disarming her. A brilliant, surgical opening. "My question is not about your love for your daughter, which is unquestionable. It is about the facts of that night. You didn't see anyone near the library, correct?" Elena, wrung out and hollow, shook her head. "No. You have no personal knowledge of who might have sent a text to her phone?
No.
And the witness, the man your own community initially suspected, Carl Jenkins. You would agree he is a troubled man, often seen in that area? It was a masterstroke, linking the initial failed suspect to the family's own grief-induced search for answers. Elena looked at him, a faint flare of confusion and anger cutting through her numbness. I don't know him. Of course not, Richard said soothingly. You were looking for answers anywhere you could find them. We all were. He was about to sit down. He had done his job. He had framed the tragedy as a mystery still unsolved, and separated his client from the raw, human agony of it all. He turned, giving the jury a look that said, "See? Even in her pain, she has no evidence against my son." And that's when it happened. Lucas Thorne watched his father's performance. He saw the subtle win. He felt the equilibrium of the room shift, the crushing weight of Elena's testimony being deftly, legally lifted from their side of the scale and placed back in the center, as an unsolved community tragedy. A wave of profound satisfaction washed over him. It was clean. It was intelligent. It was victory. His father returned to the table and leaned down, putting a hand on Lucas's shoulder, whispering one quiet, strategic thing. "Perfect. Just stay still." But Lucas wasn't just still. He was triumphant. And in that moment of soaring intellectual pride, the algorithm of his performance hit a glitch. The sheer, blinding certainty that he had won, that he had sat through that gut-wrenching display and his father had legally vaporized its relevance, overrode his careful programming. He didn't laugh. He didn't sneer. He smirked. It was a tiny, fleeting thing. A quick, downward tug at the corner of his mouth that wasn't a smile. It was a punctuation mark. A period at the end of his father's sentence. It said, "See? I told you. Emotion is weak. Logic wins." It lasted less than a second. But in the absolute, suffocating silence of that courtroom, where every eye was a sensor and every heart was an open wound, it was like a gunshot. Elena Flores saw it from the stand. Her breath caught. Her eyes, which had been pools of exhaustion, sharpened into points of pure, crystalline understanding. A juror gasped, a tiny intake of air. And Judge Aaron Blackwood. He had been watching Lucas the whole time. Through Elena's testimony, he hadn't seen a grieving boy. He'd seen a calculator. And now, the calculator had finally displayed its result: contempt. Judge Blackwood's hand, resting lightly on his gavel, closed. His knuckles went white. The pressure traveled up his arm, into his jaw, which tightened like a vice. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. With a sound that cracked the sacred silence wide open, a sharp, sickening snap, the wooden handle of his gavel split clean in two under the force of his grip. The smaller piece tumbled from his fist and clattered onto the bench. Every single head in the courtroom swiveled from Lucas to the judge. Lucas's smirk vanished, replaced by blank, algorithmic surprise. Error. Unexpected input. Judge Blackwood rose to his feet. Slowly, deliberately. The weight of his robes, the weight of his office, the weight of every ghost he carried, seemed to coalesce into a single terrifying gravity around him. He wasn't a judge anymore. He was a man pushed past a line he didn't know he had. His eyes, dark and burning, pinned Lucas to his chair. And when he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous vibration that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine. "You think this is a game?" For a heartbeat after the gavel snapped, nothing moved. The sound still seemed to hang in the air, a physical thing. The judge's question, "You think this is a game?" didn't feel like a question. It felt like a verdict delivered ahead of schedule. Then, Judge Blackwood let the broken piece of wood fall from his fingers. It tapped once on the bench. The sound was impossibly loud. "Court is in recess," he said, his voice back to its measured judicial tone, but with a new icy undercurrent. 15 minutes. Counsel, defendant, in my chambers. Now." He didn't wait. He turned and walked through the door behind the bench, his robe swirling. The courtroom exploded into a pandemonium of whispers. Reporters scrambled for the doors to file bulletins. The Flores family huddled together, confusion and a faint, terrible hope on their faces. Richard Thorne was already on his feet, a storm gathering behind his composed mask. He gripped his son's elbow. "Not a word," he hissed. "Do not speak." Lucas stood, his mind racing. The smirk was gone, erased by a cold wave of miscalculation. Error. The judge's emotional response is irrational. A breach of protocol. He followed his father and the somber-faced bailiff through the side door, down a short, windowless corridor, and into the judge's private chambers. The room was nothing like the courtroom. It was quiet, lined with books, dominated by a large, tidy desk. Judge Blackwood stood at a small sink in the corner, methodically washing his hands, his back to them. The water ran. He shut it off, dried his hands on a plain white towel, and turned. He didn't sit. "Richard," he said, nodding to the defense attorney. Then his eyes, like two chips of flint, landed on Lucas. "Lucas." "Your Honor," Richard Thorne began, his voice a polished instrument of protest. "That display in there, the broken gavel, it was highly prejudicial. I must move for a mistrial. The jury's perception." "Your motion is noted," Blackwood cut him off, his gaze never leaving Lucas. "And denied. This isn't about the jury right now." He took a step closer. The room felt smaller, airless. "This is a conversation between him and me." Lucas's father moved to stand slightly in front of his son. "Your Honor, I must object to any ex parte communication that—" "He's not a child in need of shielding, Richard," Blackwood said, his voice dangerously soft. "He's a young man on trial for murder. And based on what I just witnessed, he seems to be under the impression he's the smartest person in any room he walks into." He finally shifted his gaze to the older Thorne. "You've done a remarkable job crafting a defense. It's elegant, logical, almost beautiful in its cold precision." He paused, letting the backhanded compliment hang. "But you made one mistake. You forgot to teach your client the most important rule." He looked back at Lucas. "The rule is this: the courtroom isn't a logic puzzle. It's a place where human beings come for something they call justice. And when you smirk at a mother describing the silence where her daughter's laugh used to be, you are no longer a defendant. You become an insult. Not just to her, but to this entire process. You think we don't see you? Calculating. Cataloging." Lucas felt a strange, new sensation, a prickling on the back of his neck. The judge wasn't talking about evidence. He was talking about him. About the inner monologue he thought was invisible. "I've seen your type before," Blackwood continued, walking slowly around the edge of his desk. "The brilliant, disconnected mind. You see grief as sentiment. You see procedure as a system to hack. You look at the tears in that gallery and you see a tactical weakness to be exploited." He stopped directly in front of Lucas. "Tell me I'm wrong." Lucas's mouth was dry. His algorithms offered no response. This was a hostile query with no correct answer. "Your silence is an answer," Blackwood said. He picked up the broken head of the gavel from his desk, turning it over in his hand. "I've been a judge for 18 years. I've sent men to die. I've watched families break. I have never broken a gavel." He looked up. "You managed that today. Congratulations." He leaned in, just slightly. His voice dropped to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "So understand me, Lucas. The game you thought you were playing? It's over. You just activated a new one. And in this game, the rules are mine. You wanted a challenge? You wanted to prove your intellectual superiority to this whole sad, messy room." A cold, grim smile touched the judge's lips for the first time. "From this moment forward, this trial is no longer about whether you killed Maya Flores. The evidence will speak for itself. This is now about proving, to this jury and to yourself, the one thing I already know." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was taut. "That you are a fool." He straightened up. 15 minutes are up. We're going back in. And you, young man, are going to sit there and you are going to learn what happens when someone who understands the rules decides to change them. He turned and walked out of the chambers, leaving Lucas and his father in the silent, stale air. For the first time since that night in the fog, Lucas Thorne felt a real, human emotion cut through the cold logic of his mind. It was fear, not of prison, but of being seen. When they walked back into the courtroom, you could feel the difference. It was like the air had been chemically altered. Before, it was tension. Now, it was a hunting ground. Judge Blackwood took the bench. A new, plain wooden gavel lay beside him. His face was a mask of calm neutrality again. But his eyes, they were different. They were active, scanning, calculating. He wasn't just presiding anymore. He was conducting an experiment. Lucas sat down, the judge's words, "You are a fool," echoing in the silent chamber of his mind. He tried to recompile his code, to reset. The judge is an emotional variable. Unpredictable. Must adapt. He schooled his face back into attentive, respectful concern. But the fear was a low hum in his circuitry, a background process he couldn't shut down. The prosecution called their next witness, a digital forensic analyst. Dry, technical stuff. She started explaining the metadata on the burner phone, the tower pings. Richard Thorne stood for cross-examination, ready to dismantle it. "Agent, you can't definitively say who purchased this phone, correct?" "That's correct." "And you can't tie its activation or use to my client in any way?" "Not directly, no." "Standard. Expected." Lucas felt a flicker of reassurance. The logic was holding. Then Judge Blackwood leaned forward. "Agent," he interrupted, his voice casual. "Leaving aside who used it, based on the timing and location of these pings, would you say the person who used this phone exhibited a degree of premeditation? Planning?" Lucas's father was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation. The witness is a technical analyst, not a behavioral psychologist." Judge Blackwood nodded slowly, as if considering it. Sustained. He looked at the jury. The jury will disregard the question. But he'd asked it. And a word had been planted in the room like a seed. Premeditation. The trap was subtle. He wasn't ruling for one side or the other. He was expanding the playing field. Letting in air where before there had only been legal technicalities. The next day, it happened again. The prosecution, struggling, tried to introduce evidence of Lucas's old-school projects, hacking the cafeteria point system, creating an algorithm to match students for a sociology experiment. His father objected vehemently. "Relevance, Your Honor. This is character assassination, not evidence." Judge Blackwood steepled his fingers. "The defense makes a fair point, Mr. Thorne. However," he turned to the jury, "the prosecution is arguing a specific mindset, a pattern of seeing systems and people as problems to be solved. I'll allow it for limited purpose. Proceed." Lucas felt a jolt. This was off-script. This was about him, not the night of the fog. He watched as the prosecutor displayed his old code on the screen, talking about cold, efficient logic. The jury looked from the complex lines of code to Lucas's face. He kept his expression neutral, but inside, he was furious. They were dissecting his genius and calling it a symptom. And then, the bait was dangled. Later, the prosecutor was questioning a detective about the lack of physical evidence. Flustered, she misspoke. "So, the perpetrator left no trace because he was, in your opinion, lucky?" Richard Thorne nearly rolled his eyes. It was a gift. Objection. Detective's opinion on luck is not evidence. But before the judge could rule, Lucas's own intellect betrayed him. He leaned over to his father and whispered, too loud, "It wasn't luck. It was superior planning. The fog was a known variable." The microphone at the table picked it up. A soft, clear murmur in the silent room. Judge Blackwood's head snapped toward him. Not with anger. With interest. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his tone almost conversational, "would you like to clarify that for the court?" Lucas froze. His father's hand clamped down on his wrist under the table. Shut up. But the bait had been taken. The challenge had been issued. The judge had created a space where Lucas's greatest weakness, his need to be seen as the smartest person in the room, was now a legal liability. "Withdrawn, Your Honor," Richard Thorne said tightly. "Of course," Blackwood said, a faint, unreadable smile touching his lips. He addressed the jury. "You will disregard the defendant's unsolicited comment." But the damage was done. The jury had heard it. It wasn't luck. It was superior planning. The message was received. He wasn't a scared kid. He was a tactician, analyzing the crime even now. As the day ended, Lucas walked back to the holding cell, his mind churning. The fear was being burned away by a new, more familiar fuel: indignation. They were twisting his intelligence against him. They were letting this emotional, broken system judge the purity of his logic. He didn't see the trap for what it was. He saw it as a new, more challenging level of the game. The judge had changed the rules. Fine. He would still win. He would just have to be smarter. He sat on the hard bunk, replaying the day's moves. The judge's unusual rulings. The prosecutor's clumsy statements. His own, almost perfect, correction of her error. A dangerous certainty solidified in his chest. Blackwood thought he was exposing him. But he was just giving Lucas a bigger stage. The fox was convinced it was outsmarting the hunter, not realizing the hunter was patiently herding it toward a cliff. It was a gamble. A huge one. But Richard Thorne believed in his son's greatest asset, his mind. The prosecution's case was a haunted house, all creaky floors and spooky sounds, but no solid monster. If Lucas could walk through it, calmly turning on the lights, explaining every strange noise, the jury would see there was nothing there. So, against the quiet, screaming instinct in his gut, he called Lucas Thorne to the stand. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The boy accused of murder, speaking in his own defense. Lucas stood, smoothed his sweater, and walked to the witness box with a calm, deliberate pace. He swore the oath, his voice clear and steady. He looked at the jury, not with a challenge, but with an open, almost scholarly earnestness. The prince was back, ready to hold court. For the first hour, it was a masterclass. His father guided him through a series of soft, logical questions. "Lucas, did you have any reason to wish harm on Maya Flores?" "No. She was an acquaintance. A kind person. The prosecution suggests you were fascinated by her. Is that true?" "I found her social adaptability interesting. From a sociological perspective. That's all. Explain your whereabouts on the night of October 26th. And he did. Not defensively, but like a professor reviewing a mildly complex schedule. Study time. Online gaming session. He even described the game's objectives with a nerdy, convincing detail. He was rational, precise, and utterly, chillingly plausible. The jury listened. Some nodded. He was demystifying himself before their eyes. The monster in the stories was just a smart, slightly awkward kid with a passion for systems. Then, it was the prosecutor's turn. Ada Collins went hard. She fired questions about the burner phone, the fog, his research into Maya's life. But Lucas was ready. He had an answer for everything, each one wrapped in a sheath of cold reason. Why look up her public schedule? I was considering asking her to study. I wanted to optimize the timing. Why the interest in digital forensics? It's a hobby, like chess. Do you feel any remorse for her loss? A pause. It's a tragedy. I understand the statistical probability of violent crime, even in our community. It's illogical, but it happens. He wasn't just defending himself. He was lecturing. And with each poised, intelligent answer, he could feel the control returning. The judge's little mind games, the emotional trap of the courtroom. He was navigating it all. He was winning. Judge Blackwood watched, silent as a stone. Finally, Ada Collins, frustration tightening her voice, said, "No further questions." She sat down, looking at the mountain of logic she had just failed to move. Richard Thorne allowed himself a small, relieved breath. It was over. His son had been perfect. But then, Judge Blackwood did not call for the next witness. He did not adjourn. He leaned forward, his elbows on the bench, and looked at Lucas with an expression of pure academic curiosity. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice devoid of any anger. It was the tone of a man asking for directions. "I have one question. It's not about the evidence. It's philosophical." Lucas's father was instantly on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "I'm not asking for legal analysis, counsel," Blackwood said calmly, his eyes still on Lucas. "I'm asking for the young man's opinion, as the intelligent, logical person he has presented himself to be." He paused. "You may answer if you wish." Lucas met his gaze. The fear was gone. This was the ultimate validation. The judge, his supposed adversary, was acknowledging his intellect, asking for his opinion. "I'll answer," Lucas said. "What?" Judge Blackwood asked, his words slow and clear. "Is the purpose of consequence?" Lucas blinked. It was so broad, so elementary. A smile touched his lips. He had this. He could dissect this in his sleep. "Consequence," he began, settling into the rhythm of a thesis defense, "is a societal control mechanism. It's a feedback loop designed to regulate behavior that the collective has deemed suboptimal or threatening to its stability. It's not inherently moral or immoral. It's pragmatic." He warmed to his topic. He could see the jury watching, captivated. He was teaching them now. For example, the consequence for theft isn't about the metaphysical wrongness of taking an object. It's about preserving the system of property ownership, which allows for commerce and social order. The punishment is a deterrent signal, not a cosmic balancing of scales. He was soaring now, in his element. The courtroom was his lecture hall. So, to answer your question, the purpose of consequence is purely utilitarian. It maintains system integrity. The idea that it's about justice or making someone pay is an emotional construct. A useful fiction for the masses, perhaps, but not the core function. He finished. The room was quiet. He had been brilliant, clear, unassailably logical. He looked at Judge Blackwood, expecting to see respect, or at least thoughtful consideration. What he saw instead was a deep, profound pity. Judge Blackwood didn't speak to Lucas. He turned slowly to the jury. His gaze traveled from face to face, letting Lucas's words, cold, clean, and utterly soulless, hang in the air between them. He didn't need to say a word. His face said it all. This, his silence screamed to the 12 men and women, this is the mind that conceived of your neighbor's daughter as a system error. This is the logic of the crime. The spell was broken. The prince's eloquent, chilling monologue wasn't a defense. It was a confession. In that moment, Lucas Thorne, the brilliant logician, finally understood the trap. The question wasn't a test of his intelligence. It was a request for a self-portrait. And he had just painted a masterpiece of monstrosity. They deliberated for less than 8 hours. In the courtroom, waiting for a verdict, time doesn't move in a straight line. It pools. It thickens. Every tick of the clock on the wall is a hammer strike. The Flores family sat in a tight, silent cluster, not praying, just waiting. Maya's mother, Elena, held her son Miguel's hand so tightly their knuckles were white mosaics. Lucas sat at the defense table, back straight. His father had prepared him for this moment. If it's not guilty, remain calm, humble. If it's guilty, show nothing. Nothing. It's just a step in the process, an appealable error. Lucas ran the scenarios in his head like simulation software. Output A. Output B. His heart was a steady, metronomic thump in his chest. A biological process. Data input pending. When the bailiff said, "The jury has reached a verdict," The sound was like a key turning in a lock deep inside the building. They filed in. The 12 men and women wouldn't look at him. Not one. They looked at the judge, at the floor, at their own hands. That was the first piece of data. Lucas's internal log registered it. Jury visual contact, 0. Anomaly. Foreperson. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the single count of murder in the first degree, how do you find the defendant, Lucas Thorne? A breath held by 100 people. We find the defendant guilty. It wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, final word. A stone dropped into a deep well. The reaction was a wave of sound, a gasp that swept the gallery, a sob from the Flores family that was equal parts relief and fresh, unbearable pain. Elena Flores buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. It was over. It changed nothing, and it changed everything. Richard Thorne's hand came down on his son's shoulder, a grip of steel. "Don't move," he whispered, the words tight with a professional fury already pivoting to the next move, the appeal. But Lucas didn't move because he was processing. Guilty. The word was an input. It entered his system and stalled. It did not compute. It contradicted the logical framework he had built. The evidence was flawed. The reasoning was emotional. The output was wrong. He watched the scene unfold as if through thick glass. The prosecutors shaking hands, their faces grim but satisfied. The jury being polled, each guilty, a redundant echo that further cluttered his processing queue. His father standing to make motions, his voice a distant, buzzing sound. He felt a hand on his arm, a bailiff. It was time to be led away. He stood. He turned. And as he did, his eyes met those of Judge Aaron Blackwood. The judge was not celebrating. He was not smiling. He looked at Lucas with an expression of immense, weary finality. There was no "I told you so" there. Only the grim satisfaction of a dirty job being done. The scaffold had held. In that glance, Lucas's system generated its first emotional error message. It wasn't fear of the prison cell that awaited him. It wasn't anger at the jury's failure of logic. It was confusion. A profound, disorienting bafflement. The puzzle had been solved incorrectly. The verdict was a glitch in reality itself. He, the master programmer, was being flagged as the virus. It made no sense. As he was led through the side door, back into the sterile, fluorescent-lit bowels of the courthouse, the sounds of the weeping family faded away. The door shut with a solid thunk, sealing him in silence. In the holding cell, waiting for transport, he sat on the cold metal bench. His mind reran the trial. The evidence. His testimony. The judge's questions. He searched for the bug, the misstep. He found only elegant, unassailable logic on his part, and a cascade of emotional, irrational inputs from the world. For the first time, his intelligence offered him no solution, no next move. It only screamed one thing at him, on a loop: illogical. 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 The void wasn't in the cell around him. It was inside his own mind. The one thing he had always relied on, his brilliant, flawless logic, had just delivered him a result that was, by its own standards, impossible. He had been found guilty by a system he despised. And the terrifying, inescapable question began to form in the void. What if the system wasn't broken? What if he was? The place they sent Lucas Thorne wasn't a prison. Not in the traditional sense. It was a state psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. The verdict was guilty, but the unspoken addendum was, and broken. His cold, logical monologue on the stand had seen to that. They housed him in a wing with others whose minds were prisons themselves. To Lucas, they were just more irrational systems, babbling and rocking in the corner. He barely noticed them. His routine was meticulous. He had no interest in rehab, in therapy, in finding remorse. He had a new project: the appeal. His father, though disgraced and professionally shattered, still sent him legal materials. Lucas pored over them, not with hope, but with the analytical fury of a chess master reviewing a lost game, determined to find the single move he'd missed. He was writing a brief, not for the courts, but for himself. A towering, complex document that deconstructed the entire trial as a series of procedural and logical errors. He filled notebooks with algorithms charting jury bias. It was his new masterpiece. The perfect crime had failed, but the perfect defense, that was still solvable. He just had to find the key. So when the guard came one afternoon and said, "You have a visitor. It's not your lawyer," Lucas felt a flicker of curiosity. An unknown variable. He was led to a private, secure visitation room. Not the kind with glass and phones. A small, clinical room with a bolted-down table. And sitting on the other side, in a simple coat, looking older and quieter than he had on the bench, was Judge Aaron Blackwood. Lucas froze in the doorway. The system threw an error. Judge. Present. Context. Post-verdict. No legal basis for interaction. Threat. "Sit down, Lucas," Blackwood said. His voice had no judicial authority here. It was just a man's voice, tired and flat. Lucas sat, his hands instinctively folding on the table. He said nothing. He would gather data first. Blackwood didn't speak for a long moment. He just looked at Lucas, as if examining a specimen in a jar. "How's the appeal coming?" he finally asked. Lucas's eyes narrowed. "My legal work is protected. You have no standing here." "I'm not here as a judge," Blackwood said. "I retired 2 weeks after your trial." He let that hang. "I'm here as the man who figured you out." A spark of cold anger, the first real emotion since the verdict, ignited in Lucas's chest. "You figured out nothing. You manipulated an emotional jury. You allowed a verdict based on a smirk." "No," Blackwood said calmly. "The verdict was based on who you are. The smirk just helped everyone else see it." He reached into the bag at his feet and placed a simple, unlabeled folder on the table. He didn't open it. "I did some digging of my own. After the trial. Not as a judge. As a man with too many questions." Lucas stared at the folder. "Irrelevant. Double jeopardy applies. You can't retry me." "I don't want to retry you," Blackwood said, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "I want to show you something." He flipped the folder open. Inside weren't legal documents. They were photographs. Printouts. Maps. "The drainage culvert where the burner phone died," Blackwood said, tapping a photo. "A quarter-mile from the bus station where you ditched the rental car. You walked back, through a neighborhood called the Pines. You remember that night, Lucas? The fog was thick, but it was cold. The ground was soft from the afternoon rain." Lucas's blood went still. He said nothing. Blackwood slid another photo forward. It was a close-up of muddy soil. "There's a backyard on Cypress Lane, third house from the corner. The fence is low. The soil in the flower bed there, right by the fence line, it held an impression. A very clear, size 11 boot print. The tread pattern is unusual. A specific brand of waterproof hiking boot sold at only one store in a 50-mile radius." He looked up. "The purchase records for that boot, paid for in cash, from 2 months before the murder, are in here. The security footage from that store is remarkably clear for a cash transaction." Lucas's mind was racing, accessing files he thought he'd deleted. The boots. He'd buried them deep in a landfill a week later. But the purchase. "The digital alibi was clever," Blackwood continued, his voice conversational. "The pre-recorded loop of your gaming session. But transferring that large of a data packet in real time, while also executing a complex in-game maneuver, it would require a massive, steady bandwidth. Far more than your home Wi-Fi provided on its own." He slid a technical report forward. "A forensic audit of your household's internet node shows a secondary, hidden signal booster was active that night, drawing power from an external battery pack. A device not found in any subsequent search of your home. You must have discarded it." He pushed another sheet. "The chemical used to subdue Maya floris. A specific, industrial-grade solvent. Not easy to get. But a bottle was reported missing from the inventory of your high school's advanced chemistry lab 3 weeks prior. The teacher noted it because the cupboard had been professionally picked, not forced. You were a teacher's aide in that lab, Lucas. You had the code. With each piece of paper, each calm revelation, Lucas felt the walls of his mind, the clean, logical fortress he'd built, begin to sweat and crack. These weren't emotional arguments. These were facts. Flaws. Bugs in his code he never knew existed. I found all of this, Blackwood said, leaning back and folding his hands. Months of work. A clearer, more compelling case than the prosecution ever had. He paused, his eyes locking onto Lucas's. I never submitted it. I never gave it to the police or the DA. The error message in Lucas's mind was now a screaming siren. Why? Because I didn't need it, Blackwood said, answering the unspoken question. The trial wasn't about proving what you did. We all knew what you did. It was about proving who you are. And you did that for me, beautifully, on the stand. With your perfect, soulless logic. He gestured to the damning folder. This was just my hobby. My own puzzle. And I solved it. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a whisper. You thought you were playing a game of wits against a system. But the system was never the law, Lucas. It was reality. And reality leaves traces. You missed them. You were so busy being brilliant, so obsessed with the elegance of the big picture, that you got sloppy with the details. The mud. The receipt. The bandwidth. He gathered the papers slowly, putting them back in the folder, each one a nail in the coffin of Lucas's self-image. I wanted you to know, Blackwood said, standing up. I wanted you to lie awake in here, not wondering about the unfair emotional jury, but knowing, in that perfect logical mind of yours, that your masterpiece was flawed. That it was always going to fail, because you are not the genius you believe you are. You're just a smart kid who made 3 crucial, stupid mistakes. He walked to the door and knocked for the guard. He looked back one last time at Lucas, who sat paralyzed, his face ashen. You wanted a challenge? Blackwood said. The challenge was me. And you lost the moment you walked into my courtroom. The door opened and closed. Lucas was left alone with the silence, and with the devastating, inescapable new data now corrupting every file in his mind. The perfect crime had never existed. He had just been too vain to see the cracks. Time moves differently in a place like that. Not in years, but in routines. In the hum of fluorescent lights, the clang of meal trays, the silent, endless space between one thought and the same thought, repeated. Lucas Thorne's world had shrunk to a cell, a hallway, and the inside of his own skull. And the skull was the real prison. He'd abandoned the legal appeal. Judge Blackwood's visit had corrupted that file forever. Instead, he worked on a new, endless project, reconstructing the perfect crime. He would sit for hours, eyes closed, replaying that night. But now, he inserted the flaws. The muddy boot. The receipt. The signal booster. In his mind, he'd go back and fix them. He'd take a different route. He'd wear different shoes. He'd create a more elegant alibi. He was debugging the past, line by line, building a flawless imaginary castle in the air where he never got caught. The staff left him to it. They saw a young man, quiet and cooperative, scribbling in notebooks filled not with rage or madness, but with complex schematics and flowcharts. They didn't understand that this was his insanity. He was serving a life sentence inside the one place he believed was impregnable. His own genius. He just hadn't realized it was a cell. 40 miles away, in a modest office with a view of a community garden, Aaron Blackwood worked too. His desk wasn't a judge's bench. It was littered with pamphlets, grant applications, and case files from a victims' advocacy network. He answered emails, counseled grieving families, helped navigate the clunky, heartbreaking bureaucracy that follows violence. The work was small, undramatic, and exhausting. He never mentioned the Thorne case. But sometimes, when a parent sat across from him, their eyes hollow with a loss that words could not touch, he would see Elena Flores. He would hear the snap of the gavel. And he would lean in, a little closer, and listen. He wasn't trying to atone. He didn't believe he could. He was just building a different kind of scaffold, one made of small acts, of bearing witness, of making sure the silence that followed tragedy wasn't quite as absolute. It was his new routine. And in it, he found a fragile kind of peace. The ghosts were still there, but he was no longer just their warden. He was their guide. One autumn afternoon, a new lawyer was touring the Santa Barbara County Courthouse. A fresh-faced public defender, getting a feel for the arena. Her guide, an old bailiff, showed her the empty, majestic courtroom of Department 14. "This is where Judge Blackwood presided. Famous case a few years back," the bailiff said, his voice echoing in the vaulted quiet. "Thorn case. Kid killed a girl. Thought he was a genius. Judge snapped a gavel right in half. Never seen anything like it." The young lawyer walked down the aisle, running a hand along the smooth, cold wood of the jury box. The room was spotless, silent, waiting for its next drama. "Spooky, huh?" the bailiff said. "Sometimes, when it's real quiet like this, the night janitors say they still hear it." "Hear what?" the lawyer asked. The old man smiled a little. "The crack. Just a faint snap. Like an echo that got stuck in the walls." He was probably just telling a tale, trying to impress the new kid. But for a second, they both stood still, listening. And in the deep, solemn silence of the empty courtroom, it was easy to believe it was true. That some sounds, a breaking gavel, a mother's sob, the cold logic of a monster, don't just fade away. They seep into the grain of the wood. They become part of the place. They become a warning, whispered from the past to anyone who thinks the law is a game, or that a human heart is just a puzzle to be solved. This was a story about arrogance. About the fatal flaw of believing yourself above consequence, beyond emotion. Lucas Thorne's downfall wasn't a footprint in the mud or a receipt. It was the moment he forgot that the most complex system he'd ever try to hack isn't digital. It's human. And it always has the final debug. If this story made you think, made you feel that tension between cold logic and raw justice, then do me a favor. Share your thoughts in the comments. What was Lucas's true fatal flaw? Was it the smirk, or something deeper? And if you crave more deep dives into the psychology of a downfall, make sure you're subscribed. Because the next story is already waiting.